everyone, my name is Victoria Duggan, and I am pursuing my Master's in Training and Development at NC State University. As part of my coursework in the program, I was tasked with interviewing a practicing instructional designer to examine the relationship between instructional design theory and best practices and the reality of what actually working as an instructional designer looks like. Today's presentation will provide you with an overview of what I learned from this experience. Before we jump in, I just want to provide a brief summary of what we will cover today. So we will begin with a bit of background on Catherine Dorsett, the instructional designer I chose to interview. I will also share how I chose to interview Catherine and why she was the best fit for my learning interests. Next, we will dig into how the theory and best practices outlined in the course literature compare to Catherine's actual instructional design practice, and finish with some key takeaways of the entire interview process. So a little bit about Catherine. Her educational background is centered on instructional design, and she received her Master of Science in Instructional Technology at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington after pursuing her undergraduate degree in Fine Arts from Marshall University. She has worked at NC State for the past 13 plus years, and prior to her current role, she held an instructional design position at the Savannah College of Art and Design, preceded by a position as a web developer and designer at North Carolina Office of Information Technology Services. So Dorsett credits her career in instructional design as a kind of happy accident that occurred while she was working as a print designer at UNC Wilmington. Her supervisor at the time suggested they get a degree together focused on instructional technology. The program at UNCW provided a hybrid online and in-person delivery format combination, and the format and course content really worked with her brain. And soon after beginning the course, she was hooked on instructional design. She studied everything from theory to videography and even had classes on how to teach. While she was earning her master's, she had the wonderful opportunity to fly to California, where she had the opportunity to study under a web design expert, Linda Weinman, who actually created what is now known as LinkedIn Learning, formerly lynda.com. During that time, she became fascinated with course design and credits this period of her educational journey as pivotal for building her foundational understanding and appreciation of instructional design. When she finished her master's, she initially worked for the state, developing websites in the project management realm. She worked with stakeholders and subject matter experts in the public health sector to get their content online in that role. And during her time working with the state, she created elements for an early iteration of a learning management system, which included discussion lists, to-do lists, and learning outcomes. Her next role at Savannah Art and Design allowed her to focus strictly on instructional design, where she designed programs and content on self-contained websites. All of the courses she designed were online and followed a self-driven format called SCAD e-learning. And during this time, she also served as a project manager, which helped her develop skills she still uses in the instructional design field today. Her final move was to transition to working in the Digital Education and Learning Technology Applications Department, also known as Delta, at NC State. And that is where she continues to work today. So my connection with Catherine happened pretty naturally. I knew I wanted to interview someone who worked at NC State, as I'm interested in instructional design and higher education, as that is a direction I can see myself going once my degree concludes. I also knew there were a lot of instructional designers at NC State, so for this reason, I actually developed my interview questions first so that I had a way to narrow down instructional designers on LinkedIn. My questions were centered on higher education, but also on my interest in gamification and virtual reality, and how these methods and approaches impact and enhance instructional design and learner experience. So when I found Catherine, her skills were very much in line with my interests, and she just seemed like a very passionate and curious person who I could learn a lot from. So luckily, she responded right away, and I'm so glad she did because we had a very fruitful discussion about instructional design, theory versus actual practice. So now to dig into theory versus practice, we learn from instructional design literature that the utilization of an instructional design model sets instructional designers up for success in identifying learning gaps and problems, and also helps instructional designers determine whether they can actually solve a learning problem. While there are many instructional design models available for application, all of which have similar but different purposes and uses, the Analyze, Design, Develop, Implement, Evaluate model, aka ADDIE, reigns as a tried and true standard for both new and seasoned instructional designers, and serves as a foundation for many of the model variations. Another model that has gained popularity as an ideal process model is the Successive Approximation Model, aka SAM, which is defined by its iterative and collaborative process and focus on efficiency and effectiveness. So while Dorset, or Catherine, has significant respect for the traditional ADDIE instructional design model and actually used components of the model during her time working at SCAD, she admits that it is not always possible to follow a model from start to finish. And during her time at NC State, she typically combines the ADDIE model with more flexible and iterative models, such as SAM. And using variations on the SAM model, she and her team are able to define a minimum viable product, and if expansion is possible, SAM is used to develop the product further. So Catherine's experience and utilization of instructional design models is in line with other practicing instructional designers I read about in the literature, where some form of ADDIE or a blended model is utilized. So her experience does not contradict the literature there. However, Bond and Durkin in 2020 note that other practicing instructional designers utilize a variety of models not cited by Catherine, and some instructional designers actually end up using no model at all. Finally, a major theme that came from both the literature and my conversation with Catherine is that while the utilization of an instructional design model is ideal, many instructional designers are restricted to only use components of instructional design models, as resources and time constraints inhibit practitioners from being able to move through all the steps of a given model. And this can be for reasons such as like resources or time constraints or other things that are imposed on them in the workplace. Another major theme that came out of my review of the literature and conversation with Catherine was the importance of analysis. So for Catherine, the analysis phase of instructional design, whether as part of the traditional ADDIE model or a more iterative model like SAM, is crucial to the success of her instructional design projects. In her thinking, it isn't possible to find the problem without analysis. And without the problem, it isn't truly possible to evaluate iteratively or at the end of a project. So instructional designers need to know what the learners should take away from the learning experience, and analysis provides the necessary basis for this in Dorset's experience, in Catherine's experience. Morrison and others noted in 2019 that task analysis is probably the most critical step in the instructional design process, and Catherine's thinking is not far off from this. She considers analysis the most important component of any given instructional design model, as it can not only define the problem and learning objectives, but also bring challenges and learning failures to light. So in addition to analysis, Dorset also values evaluation and considers this step very important to her success as an instructional designer as well. While the literature on evaluation expounds on the value of all three forms of evaluation, or the most typical forms of evaluation, which are formative, summative, and confirmative, Catherine explained that in reality, she is lucky if she can get through one official evaluation, though she and her team have been and are more intentional about evaluation as of late. Particularly during COVID, this wasn't as easy to do because of time constraints, but it is very important to her. And of the three most common evaluation categories, Catherine relies the most on formative evaluation, where technical testing similar to artificial intelligence is employed. In her work with virtual reality and gamification, she explained that the gamification component of design and delivery is typically designed to be more supplemental in nature. So formative analysis evaluation serves well to determine if the experience of the game is working. And Morrison and others also expound on the value of formative analysis, noting that it is best utilized before the final development of the instructional product, as at this stage it's possible to see instructional issues while the instructional materials are still being formed. Dorset, or Catherine, also uses formative evaluation with her TAs that are not directly involved in projects, and utilizes a blended iterative formative evaluation style to examine different levels of skills. So in reviewing the major questions I had going into the interview, I also want to share some of the key takeaways I gained from my discussion with Catherine. So first of all, a thread that kept coming up was the role of resources and culture, and how both can greatly impact an instructional designer's ability to follow instructional design models and best practices. So we can learn all the best practices and instructional design models in our education, but if the places we work don't have the resources and culture in place to enable us to properly move through those phases, we will have to learn to adapt and operate the best we can with the tools and environments we are in as instructional designers. This was especially true for Catherine and during the pandemic, where even in a place like NC State, where she had the right culture in place, they really were operating in a kind of reactive way because so many of their colleagues were calling on them to basically move their courses online, almost simultaneously. And so, she has a supportive culture and has supportive resources, but it's easy to imagine working in an environment where the culture and the resources aren't in place, and that can really greatly inhibit an instructional designer's ability to follow best practices. Second, it is very common, as noted by Catherine in the literature, for instructional designers to wear many hats outside the traditional functions of instructional design. This can include being responsible for project management, but it can also mean that your job encompasses many responsibilities specific to the needs of your organization, including being responsible for things like videography, graphic design, creation of content, to name a few. So I think we need to be prepared for current and future instructional designers to be prepared for variation. And to that end, it's essential for instructional designers to center continued learning into their plans for success. Wearing many hats often requires instructional designers to learn new technologies and skills, as instructional design is constantly evolving and morphing to best address the needs of learners. Instructional designers need to be curious and to have a thirst for continuing to build their skills long after their degrees end. And finally, while technology is important and a very powerful tool in our instructional design toolkit, it can only take instructional designers so far. No matter how advanced technology becomes, it is still necessary to design instruction with attention to fundamental and tested instructional principles, which are rooted in the needs of learners. So that is all I have today as a result of my interview with Catherine Dorsett. I really appreciate you watching. Please feel free to contact me at vhduggan@ncsu.edu for any questions about this presentation or my interview with Catherine Dorsett, a senior instructional designer at NC State University.